I really wanted to thank you for your paper. I think it's a very concise and clear examination of the problems with Viatrovych's work, right? And I think you were able to kind of summarize that and bring it together very, very well. That was really incredibly interesting and important, I think. Viatrovych is a very polemical figure, I think, in the study of history of Ukraine, both in the West and in Ukraine. I mean, I think you're right that he has critics not only in the West, right, but also in Ukraine itself, and yet these books are very, very popular and widely read, right? I think to really interrogate the quality of the history is a very important task. And I wanted to ask you about, in a strange way, the historiography of your paper, because there is something that one could call Viatrovych studies, right? I mean, you mentioned Viatrovych in a group of historians, and like, you know, bombs go off, right? People get very, very incensed about him. You mentioned this forum in Ab Imperio, right? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of writing about criticizing his work. And I'm wondering how you see yourself engaging in that conversation, and if there's a way that, as a literature scholar, you have a special viewpoint on the conversation.
Well, I'll say a couple of things. I did write a book recently, published a book on Ukrainian nationalism, ideology, literature, politics, and so that forced me to read all that the OUN wrote, everything I could get my hands on in the 1930s, the 1940s, and the evolution of the OUN. And it's a more complicated story than many people think. And I think that's why I think this book, Viatrovych's book, is a lost opportunity. Here's an opportunity for him to educate people about what the OUN was about, how it changed, how it went through different phases, what the UPA was about, rather than get into some of these important nuances. He tends to avoid that. I think that's a lost opportunity. But also, I mean, my own interest now has shifted towards cultural memory studies, which is partly why the slides are up there. Because I can see that over the last 70 years, there's been a way of presenting Ukrainian history that has edited it substantially. And that has now, that editing process has now been swallowed by many people in Ukraine who, I mean, they don't seem to, they haven't gone through the kind of experience that I have, or people like me in the West, and they have a mythologized view of the OUN, particularly of the OUN Be. So from my point of view, I think we need to do the archaeological work and do the cultural memory study, which shows how this image has developed and changed. That's why I mentioned going back to Lebedь and the 1944 book. That is one of the keys to understanding Viatrovych. Somewhere in the archives, somewhere in the libraries, he dug this book up. He saw that this was the line that was being, there was a good line to follow, and he has produced that. And I realize that people in Ukraine have a different view because they are right now they're in a war situation. They also feel that they are being in part victimized by the discussion in Poland. Poles very often have a very negative view, and some Poles have taken a strong stance. But also, I think there's this sort of shifting of blame in many of the discourses onto local people. So there's a resistance among Ukrainians. I understand that. But as a scholar, I think it's a scholar's obligation is to look carefully at the facts, sift through them, and try and come up with an explanation of what happened. I'm not sure if that's going to satisfy people. But.
Let me jump in, Myroslav, on the question on the historical evidence before we go back to memory.
Right.
And of course, we always get very emotional or bogged down in whenever the key words genocide or ethnic cleansing are thrown in. So I'll try not to do that, actually, but still get at the strategy, the political rationale that was going on the ground in 1943, and in this case here, in the case of the UPA. That is, according to the historical evidence, the main point was to make the Poles leave, to make them leave. And we'll see with the discussion with Catherine, we have then the whole picture. It's happening on both sides of the border for many, many years, 47, either on the Polish or Ukrainian side, to make them leave. And I believe in your paper, you even use the expression draining the sea, which comes from the Civil War literature. It uses counterinsurgency. I mean, the rationale being, if we empty the villages, if we make them leave, then the insurgency on the underground, which in this case would be the Polish underground, the Armia Krajowa, can no longer operate, because of course they need civilians to operate, and particularly we're talking here the wars in the countryside. So the simple question is simple, maybe not the answer, is that is the consensus in the literature among international historians, both in Ukraine and outside, is that the strategy of the UPA, was to make them leave. To make them leave at all cost. That is, of course, you need to use pressure and sometimes extreme pressure to make people leave.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, that's the consensus. That's even what Viatrovych says. In his book, and I'm amazed that people don't actually bring this out, but in his book, if you read it carefully, that's what he says. He says, it was either, essentially the argument, the implicit argument is it's either them or us. Everybody was doing it, everybody was moving populations, and then he says it wasn't genocide. It doesn't say it wasn't ethnic cleansing. He says it was ethnic cleansing, but it wasn't violent. It was pushing them out, asking them to leave, forcing them to leave, you know, this kind of mitigating circumstances of war and all the rest of it. But yeah, even Viatrovych agrees that it was cleansing.
And if I can follow up on the historical evidence, more on the political side, before we go back to memory, it came out very well in the presentation. And we know, in the Ukrainian studies, that on studies of the pogroms in Galicia in 1941, that is also the extremely controversial question. Is the relationship to organized Ukrainian nationalism, that is, Ukrainian nationalist organizations, which in practice in 41 is the OUNB mostly on the ground in Galicia and the UPA in 43, and the violent events. And here in 43, I mean, you said the Viatrovych argument is that basically there's no chain of command here. It's not coming out from the top. It may be coming out from local commanders, but it's mostly Shuma. It's the mob, basically. It's the Jacquerie.
The Jacquerie, yeah.
Yeah, in 41 with the pogroms, it's the urban mobs, but we can't control the terrible things that are happening on the ground. And again, but maybe to reiterate, in terms of the historical evidence, is it persuasive enough to make the case that there is a degree of political chain of command here? That is, after all, that's the rationale. You have to make them leave. It's a political point here that...
Yeah, I mentioned in my article, and various scholars have mentioned this, that even if it was a decision taken by Kleczkiewski, nothing was ever said afterwards by the OUNB or the UPA to oppose that decision. They simply went along with it. That's one thing. The other part of it is that all the scholars, Timothy Snyder and others, have said that the scale of operations in Volhynia in 43, the successful cleansing, it really required something like a military, a well-oiled military operation. It also required technical knowledge of how to do mass murder, basically. And this is why the argument is made that these were policemen who were trained, who had, even if they were not involved in the Holocaust directly, they had witnessed it, they had saw how it was done, they had the techniques. So that's the argument for chain of command, for for the operation being done by the procedures and the instructions coming from the top. And Dashkevich, Yaroslav Dashkevich, Ihor Ilyushin, Yaroslav Hrycak have all said that this was Olenbe. They began it, even if peasants got involved. They could not have done such a thorough operation without the Olenbe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this, one of the things that you suggest in your paper is that this idea of jacquerie isn't an explanation, right? It doesn't actually explain the how, right? And that when we're talking about these years in the 40s in these regions, you have to explain the how, right? And I will just say I've referred to it before in private conversation, but Jared McBride's recent article actually traces that from the command down to the actual people doing the killing, right? And he's able to make that connection. So that may be something that's coming out in future research, right? That people are actually doing micro-studies to kind of try to articulate actually how this happened, right, on a local level.
Well, the micro-studies that definitely are the next stage. I think also looking at the psychology of individuals is a very interesting issue, and I mentioned that in my paper as well. That's something that has to come out. We have a lot of interesting avenues to explore. The only point I'm making is that if you read Viatrovych's text carefully, there's a lot of evidence there. He is moving in the direction of admitting to all this stuff. And I think it's, I'm not sure why. I think it's partly under the influence of the materials that he is unearthing, partly under the influence of discussions he's having, but it comes awfully close to saying, yes, this is what happened.
So this is just occurring to me right now, but it sounds like in a way you've written a paper about Viatrovych as a secondary source, but in a way he himself is a primary source, in a way to examine the changing cultural memory in Ukraine, right? That this increased exposure to sources, to conversations with other historians might actually be changing his argument?
Yes, I think so. One of the reasons why, and it came out in the Ab Imperio discussion, one of the reasons why people are so angry at Viatrovych is because he plays a little bit fast and loose with the facts. He tends to avoid stating certain things. And I think Grzegorz Motyka put it well. He said, he's like a debater scoring points. He just wants to score that point. But when you think about his argument, it doesn't actually explain anything. And that irritates a lot of people. But the weight of evidence is piling up. The other thing that upsets people a lot, and this comes up almost every critique of Viatrovych, is he had access to the materials. He was head of the archives, the SBU, and he chose certain things. Why can't we get in there? And that irritates people too. But I know that he is producing a big volume of documents, selections from the SBU archives that may help people get a better grip on what's going on, although that will certainly not reassure people that he has not pre-selected the documents.
Okay, just one quick follow-up on that, which is if we were talking about the line between art and activism this morning, I think there's a line between history and activism that we very much see in this concept of having a government institution of history, right? A government institution that's funded, that deals with archives, right, that creates a historical narrative, one historical narrative that is our history, right? And it seems like in a way the best history is not one that tries to fit into one narrative, right? And so I think there's a way that Viatrovych himself is a problem of his institutions, right? And this institutionalization of historical memory, which is in fact kind of a Soviet legacy itself, right?
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree, and I think that this whole memory wars, decommunization, he's been a major figure in that, a crucial figure, central to these discussions, and so that's one reason why I picked this book to have a closer look at it, just to let people see what I think might be the evolution he's going through.
I have a question on what I would call the political and psychological angle or dimension of memory. The most controversial, we mentioned it, and it's the same with, again, the pogroms. It's what I would call the degree of political responsibility of organizations. We're not talking people in general, nation, organizations. So chain of command, right? And it's fairly clear, and it's definitely not unique to the Ukraine case. I'm making a statement broadly here in memory studies. The conviction almost that if you start conceding that as an organization is engaged in violence against civilians for a cause, but violence against civilians, then it discredits the whole movement. It has the potential of discrediting the whole movement. Clearly in the narrative war, to be, for lack of a cruder word, or the propaganda war, but the narrative war between Russia and Ukraine in the context of the war. But the Russian narrative, which goes back actually to World War II, is to reduce the Ukrainian national organizations to violence against civilians. You call them fascists, and that's basically what they are. They're just killers. So the context, psychological and political context, is very well understood. But how can that be overcome? That is to realize that actually you can make a case that an organization, here a movement, which factually was a movement also, if not primarily, of resistance against occupation by a foreign state, namely the Soviet Union, in the areas that used to be part of Poland, in Western Ukraine, right? So others would call it a national liberation movement. Clearly, that's factual. And at the same time, engaged in, with a view towards making that possible, engage in violence against civilians. How to reconcile the two?
Well, it's a difficult problem, and that's why I mentioned that Ukrainians should learn from these discussions. You know, the Browning, Goldhagen discussion, the whole exhibition of the Wehrmacht exhibition in the 90s, and the discussion around that. All these things have been, the complexities, the nuances have been raised. I'll give you an example. Okay, so there was Volhynia in 43, 44, but the underground continued. The front came, the Red Army and the Soviet Army occupied, and resistance took off. What about all those young men and women who participated, who joined the UPA after 45, 44, 45, and put up a heroic resistance for several years, fought hard? What about those people who resisted the depopulation and the expulsions from their ancestral lands in Poland? They fought very hard. It took years for them to be thrown out. Well, they may not even have been members of the ONB. They joined because it was it was a resistance. The UPA is not necessarily the same thing as the ONB. And they may not have been involved in any kind of ethnic cleansing or Holocaust at all. So it's a very complicated issue. And we don't get anywhere closer to understanding this if we sort of mythologize it and make it into one name. I mean, nowhere in Viatrovych's book does he ever use ONB or ONM or ONZ or any of those acrostics. The only one is ON, as though there always was, as though, you know, Banda was the one and only leader. That's all he ever talks about. And that, for me, who has actually studied nationalism, now I was very irritated by that.
I was very struck in one moment in the book you say that there's no, that you cannot have a common narrative, that there are too many different voices and the memory is too sort of polyvalent to have a common narrative. And I guess I'd love to hear both of you talk to each other about that. And Myroslav, it seems like in a way you're searching for a common narrative, right? That Viatrovych missed this opportunity, right? And that there are holes that this book could have filled. And I wonder, kind of on a more philosophical level, is it possible to have common historical memory, or is it always fractured?
Well, there is this concept in cultural memory studies called multidirectional memory, where these things, the point of the historian or the researcher is to explore the differences. But this is just from listening to Catherine, one sees how complicated this business is. How many different elements are involved, how in different years, at different times, it looks different. When I was listening to Catherine, I kept thinking of the stories I had been told personally about individuals, and they speak about their own local experience. Their local experience happened at a particular time, in a particular year, in a particular place, and that becomes family history, that becomes group history. We need to have studies which bring these things together. I'm looking forward to reading your book. It sounds like a really important one and a fascinating way of bringing this together. It doesn't also help that the whole thing has become so politicized now in the last year. We have a film that Volhynia that's out, that's been banned in Ukraine. It's not going to help that we have politicians involved and with access to grind. So it's going to take a lot of extricating, I believe.
I'll have a political question to Catherine, and then we'll open the floor for a general discussion of both presentations. I'll call it the push factor, and how and why people left, right? It seems to me there's two factors, although it may actually be the same rationale: ethnic violence and then state violence. In Volhynia and in Holmshina, I think it was pretty clearly laid out. People eventually wanted to leave because they were attacked. They were attacked either by organized Ukrainians or organized Poles in the Holmshina region. On the grounds of ethnic homogenization. This is our land, and basically this is Ukrainian land or Polish land. But then we learned that actually most Ukrainians in Poland, and then when we go south, the San region and then the Lem coast, they were forcibly displaced by the army. I mean, there was some ethnic violence, but mostly the ethnic violence was in the north. And of course, the Poles in Galicia who lived in the countryside were also attacked. So they took refuge initially in the city, and then they were moved by a decision of the Soviet state. The simple question, that was a complex answer, is why would the Polish state, or the Soviet state, but let's talk about the Polish state here for San and the Lem coast, decide actually to deport the entire Ukrainian population outside of immediate ethnic conflict?
Yes, I started to answer talking about the other side of the border, because I think it was the way to implement the new border regime according to the Soviet policy, and they couldn't implement these regimes. It means a total empty zone of population. They couldn't do it on the Ukrainian side, and they decided to do it on the Polish one. And I think it is it is really for state strategical interest of protecting the borders.
Oh, okay. To make sure, because myself, I was not 100% clear. Now
Okay.
it's crystal clear. She's referring to an old standing, actually, going back to the 20s, Soviet policy of depopulating the borderlands on each side of the border. Well, on your side of the border, but here suddenly you have communist Poland, so Soviet Poland. And so that implementation of border policy meant these people who happened to be living at the border had to leave and might
Yes,
as well move
but
them all. Right?
Usually the Soviets are when they implemented this borders regime, it means inside the Soviet borders. But what I started to say just before is that because the way the Ukrainians were expelled from Poland and the way they arrived to Ukraine, it was impossible to implement this border regime in Ukraine. And finally, they decided to do it on the Polish side.
All clear. So we have 20 minutes or so for questions. We'll start with Yuri, Zhukov, Ariane.
Yuri Zhukov, University of Michigan. Question is for Myroslav. This debate over who did what to whom, where, and when, is this a debate that you think can be resolved with archival evidence, archival data? Because part of the problem with evaluating and responding to Viatrovych's work is that he had privileged access to the archives. He was also at various points in a position to release additional data into the public domain in potentially a biased way. But even if we lived in a perfect world where the archives could be completely declassified, would that still be enough? Because there's a multiple stage selection problem with archival evidence, right? There's the documents, there's the events, the violent events that are kept records on in the first place. Then there's the subset of those documents that make it into the archives. Then there's a subset of those that become declassified. Then, of course, there's a subset of those documents, particularly in post-Soviet countries, that they actually let you see. And social scientists, we only have control over the last couple of stages of that. I mean, in Soviet authorities and KVD, they kept meticulous records over who did what to whom, and during the parts of the conflict in which they were most directly involved, the deportations and such. Is there anything comparable to that on the Armia Krajova side or on the OUN-UPA side, something that can help us resolve this particular episode?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. There's a problem in getting to the archives and in analyzing the archival evidence, in making sure that we have as much as possible and different points of views are taken into account. I think ultimately, I mean, already there is a growing consensus. Ultimately, the serious historians, the serious researchers are moving in the direction of a consensus. When you saturate yourself in a problem, an issue, a field, you eventually get a sort of an instinct for what could have happened, what probably happened, and then you start zoning in on that. And so I think we're getting closer, but it is complicated. One thing I'll say for Viatrovych that is a positive, you know, for many, many decades, Ukrainians refused to and Alti will know about this, we refused to allow Soviet interviews, Soviet interrogations to be counted as evidence. Well, I was surprised when I read Viatrovych's book. He goes, and he had access to the secret police archives. He went through the interrogations of UPA soldiers, and he used them. Judiciously, you know, like historians, a good historian or researcher should, and pointing out that this might have been under pressure, this might have been false. So there's another layer where even if you get to the archives, you still have to analyze the thinking of the person, the situation in which the evidence was produced. However, Viatrovych and other people are now beginning to do that and are beginning to include Soviet archives. So it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle. And finally, you get bits and pieces start falling into place, and you get more of a picture. I think, yeah, I'm optimistic. I think it's great that historians from across borders and from different nationalities and groups are now convening and talking. I should have mentioned perhaps that the Ukrainians and Poles now have had several conferences and for quite a long time have been meeting and talking about these issues. The problem is not, for me anyway, as somebody who's interested in cultural memory studies, the problem is not with the historians or the researchers. They can make a decision, they can come to a consensus. What do you do with the people who have a mythologized image? And Ukrainians, as I sometimes say, are great myth makers, wonderful myth makers. So you have a simplified image, and you have the pictures and art and photographs all telling a certain story. There's a disconnect. I feel it more and more. There's a disconnect between the intellectuals and common people that you talk to. That education process is a different issue. It's a different problem, but that it's a serious problem. And
We'll take a second
Yep.
question. You here? Yes. Jan?
Oh, yeah.
Ooh, okay. Peter. Peter, yes. Peter Galadza. You want to stand up?
Thank you.
Peter, stand
Yeah,
up.
I really wanted to commend Professor Shkandrij for a fantastic presentation. I want to pick up on your point about cultural memory, and precisely because you're such a specialist in the whole field of studying the creation of symbols, mythologies. You take a figure like Banda, who for 2 generations ends up being the code word in the Soviet Union for Ukrainian patriotism or Ukrainian sovereignty, et cetera, in various circles, So, the dissident is arrested and tried and referred to as a bandiora, okay? Which, by the way, I fully agree with what you are doing, and I applaud you for the way in which you're exposing all the mythologies. My question has to do with what do you do with a people, and you're absolutely right, Ukrainians love to create mythologies. What do you do with the people who are, in many ways, the primary victims of World War II? Edgar Snow wrote that, the war on the Eastern Front is basically a war that has destroyed the Ukrainians. What do you do with a history that prevents you from actually having any World War II heroes? I mean, who could be the combatants? If you're a Ukrainian, who can be, and I'm posing this not in a polemical way. I mean, I pose this as an existential question. Some of us are like professional Ukrainians, so we kind of like, okay, so so the Red Army soldier has his problems. The Divizinik obviously has his problems. The UPA guy has his problems. And I think that you understand that one of the reasons that you can even have a phenomenon like Zhedo Bandera, supported by Kolomoisky himself, is because there is this perception that, okay, this guy was associated with Ukrainian patriotism for 2 generations, and he spent time in Sachsenhausen. His 2 brothers were, killed in Dachau. So in this search, or maybe I should just bite the authentic Christian bullet and say it's all a sham, and nobody, including Canadians, nobody, including Americans, nobody, including the French, anybody else, should be allowed to actually have war heroes. And Remembrance Day itself should be viewed as a day of ignominy for everybody. So I pose that to you first and foremost as a cultural memory and mythology specialist.
That's a difficult question. Tolstoy said, "My hero is the truth." We might want to start there. You get at the facts, you get at, you peel away the myth-making and so on. But what you're talking about, contemporary Ukraine, the Banderites, that's a whole different thing going on there. What they talk, anybody who's for independence is now tarred with the brush of a Banderite. And it's a joke. I mean, nobody believes that. Just because you're for independence, okay, let them call us Banderites. Fine, I'm a Banderite, who cares? That's a whole different world. That's a whole different issue. But the Second World War, it was a ugly, dirty, horrible cycle of events, wave after wave of violence. The brutalization that happened led to all sorts of things going wrong. And that's why I think the micro-studies and also the studies of psychology are important. How could it be that people are driven to these actions? I believe that we need to study these the complexities of what happened in various parts of Western Ukraine and what drove people to be who they were. I've never been pro-Banderite, pro-OUN. I grew up in England, which was Banderaville. It was all Banderite, and our family were not. But nevertheless, I was part of the community. My dad called them primitive. They were primitives. Like, I mean, they were ordinary folk, but they were tough, hard-headed, you know, focused on a warrior mentality. Well, so you have to talk about them the way they are. I'm not. I think a person like Viatrovych, for example, does a great disservice in not peeling away what their ideology was, for example, in the 30s. Why not say they were pro-totalitarian, they were anti-democratic, they were sectarian? We need to know that. People in Ukraine today need to know that. But they were heroic. All those boys, as I said before, who went into the underground and fought and died in defending their local turf, resisting deportation and so on, they were heroes. I mean, that was the heroic phase of it. But to sort of blend it all together and say anything that from the beginning to the end, OUN were the heroes, Bandera was the single hero, that's not true. You know, it just didn't happen that way. The OUN, by the way, the leadership of OUN in Europe had its problems with Bandera. And they were not, the Galician leadership, Shukhevich, Bandera, and so on, Lebedь, was a different animal from the old founders of the OUN who lived in Germany and in Italy and so on.
Okay,
But
we'll take another.